know that as much as we have now the reign of King Charles and Queen Consort Camilla, the future is William and Kate.
And their children.
Stories about secret royal trusts, sealed covenants, and dramatic family showdowns over inheritance circulate constantly online, especially on YouTube and social media. Almost all of them are invented dressed up with official-sounding names like charter seals and covenant trusts that don't exist in any real legal register. The real story of how the British royal family passes on wealth, land, and title is less cinematic, but genuinely interesting, and in some ways stranger than fiction. It involves 700-year-old charters, a monarch's will that a court ordered, sealed for 90 years, and a constitutional arrangement so old that parts of it predate the concept of a written constitution altogether. This piece walks through the actual mechanics, the two royal duchies, the crown estate, the sovereign grant, how personal property like Sandringham and Balmoral passes privately from monarch to monarch, and why the family's finances are structured the way they are. The most important thing to understand about royal finances is that they are not one pot of money. They're split across several legally distinct categories, and mixing them up is where most misunderstandings and most viral misinformation comes from. The Crown Estate, a vast property and land portfolio technically owned by the monarch in right of the Crown, meaning it belongs to the institution of the monarchy, not to the individual person who happens to be king or queen at the time. Its profits go to the UK Treasury, not to the royal family directly. The Duchy of Lancaster, a private estate held in trust for whoever is reigning monarch, funding their personal expenses. The Duchy of Cornwall, a private estate held for whoever is heir to the throne, currently Prince William, as Prince of Wales. Personal/private property assets the monarch or other royals own outright as individuals, like Sandringham House and Balmoral Castle, which King Charles inherited directly from Queen Elizabeth II, the way any private citizen inherits property from a parent. Each of these has its own rules for how it changes hands, and none of them work anything like the secret sealed trust with delayed activation clauses that shows up in fabricated royal drama content. The Crown Estate is probably the most misunderstood part of royal finance, mostly because its name makes it sound like the king's personal property. It isn't. The Crown Estate is a vast portfolio, huge tracts of central London real estate, rural land, agricultural holdings, and the seabed and foreshore rights around England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. This arrangement dates back to 1760, when King George III struck a deal with Parliament. He surrendered the profits generated by Crown lands to the government in exchange for a fixed annual payment, originally called the Civil List. Every monarch since has renewed a version of that deal. Today, the mechanism works like this. The Crown Estate's surplus revenue goes to the Treasury, and in return, the Treasury funds the monarch through what's called the sovereign grant, currently calculated as a percentage of the Crown Estate's profits from 2 years prior. The sovereign grant pays for the monarch's official duties, staffing, the upkeep of occupied palaces, and the administrative cost of being head of state. It is not the king's personal money to spend as he pleases, and he has no say in how the Crown Estate itself is managed. That's a public corporation run by an independent board, publishing detailed public accounts the way any large public company would. So when people talk about royal wealth and cite the Crown Estate's multi-billion-pound valuation, they're conflating an asset the monarch doesn't personally own with the family's actual private wealth. This is where things start to resemble what people imagine when they think of an inheritance. The Duchy of Lancaster is a private estate around 18,400 hectares of landholdings across England, including farmland, historic buildings, and commercial property such as the Savoy Estate in London. As of the most recent accounts, it was valued at roughly $678.7 million and generated a net income for the Crown of around $24-25 million a year. Its history goes back even further than the Duchy of Cornwall to 1265, when King Henry III granted confiscated lands to his son Edmund, who became Earl of Lancaster. Over the following century, the estate grew through marriages, forfeitures, and further royal grants. In 1399, when Henry Bolingbroke, heir to the duchy, seized the throne as Henry IV, the duchy merged with the crown. But Parliament later ensured it stayed legally separate from other crown property, so that it remained the monarch's private estate rather than public property. Critically, the Duchy of Lancaster is not the monarch's to sell. Since a 1702 Act of Parliament, the sovereign has only ever been entitled to the income the estate generates, never its underlying capital. In other words, whoever is on the throne enjoys the profits during their reign, but they can't liquidate the estate for personal gain, and it isn't something that gets divided up or bequeathed in a will the way an ordinary inheritance would. It simply passes, automatically, with the crown itself, to the next monarch. King Charles III holds the title Duke of Lancaster now, just as his mother held it before him, and just as whoever succeeds him will hold it after. The duchy pays no corporation tax, since it isn't a corporation, but following a practice Queen Elizabeth II began voluntarily in 1993, the reigning monarch pays income tax on what the duchy generates, the same as any other taxpayer would. This is the estate most relevant to the fabricated stories about Charlotte's trust and covenant documents, because it's the one that most recently changed hands from King Charles to Prince William, and so it's ripe material for invented drama. The Duchy of Cornwall was created in 1337 by Edward III specifically to give his son and heir, Prince Edward, an independent income separate from the crown. The idea, unusually forward-thinking for the 14th century, was to make sure the heir to the throne always had guaranteed financial independence, regardless of the reigning monarch's whims. It has passed, largely automatically, to the eldest son of the monarch ever since there's no dramatic will reading or discretionary decision involved. The moment the Prince of Wales's father or mother becomes monarch, the title and the estate's benefits pass to the heir as a matter of established constitutional and statutory practice, not personal choice. When Charles became king in September 2022, William automatically became Duke of Cornwall. There was no confidential document, no waiting period pegged to a state funeral, and no clause requiring anyone's public recognition as a trigger. It happened because that's what the office is. Today, the duchy comprises roughly 54,000 hectares across more than 20 counties, mostly in the southwest of England, and includes farmland, residential and commercial property, and a financial investment portfolio. Independent estimates have put its total value at around $1.314 billion. William, like his father before him, receives the surplus income the estate generates as his personal income, reported in the tens of millions of pounds annually, some of which funds his family's private life, and some of which covers official and charitable expenses. As with the Duchy of Lancaster, William doesn't own the underlying capital assets and can't simply cash them out for himself. He manages the estate and lives off its income, much as landed heirs have done in England for centuries under the same broad legal logic as a family trust, even though the duchy predates modern trust law. That said, in 2026, William did make a genuinely notable and somewhat tradition-breaking move. Reports in the Times and elsewhere indicated plans to sell off roughly 20% of the duchy's holdings over the following decade, potentially raising several £100 million to reinvest in housing and environmental projects, including tackling homelessness through developments like the one at Nansloden in Cornwall. This is a real, publicly reported shift in strategy, not a secret family conflict. It's been announced through the duchy's own annual reports and covered extensively by mainstream outlets, with William framing it as wanting the estate to do more than function as a traditional landholding. The duchy also has its own governance structure. The Duchy Council, sometimes called the Prince's Council, meets twice a year and advises the Duke on management decisions, though it's a non-executive advisory body rather than a decision-making one. There is no trust governor who can be summoned to investigate palace instructions, and no sealed folders carried between family members. The estate's finances and strategy are published in annual reports that anyone can read. Not everything is tied up in centuries-old institutional structures. Some royal property is genuinely personal, in the same legal sense as anyone else's private property. and it passes the way ordinary inheritances do through a will, subject to the same principles of English probate law as any family estate, albeit with one very unusual wrinkle. Sandringham House in Norfolk and Balmoral Castle in Scotland are the clearest examples. Both were privately owned by Queen Elizabeth II, inherited in turn from earlier monarchs, and both passed to King Charles III privately upon her death, rather than automatically with the crown the way the duchies do. This means they could, in principle, be sold, given away, or bequeathed differently. They are treated as the private property of whoever is monarch at the time, not permanently bound to the office itself. The unusual wrinkle is confidentiality. Royal wills in the UK have, for over a century, been sealed by the courts, rather than made public, a practice that traces back to a 1911 case involving Prince Francis of Teck, and was reaffirmed by the Court of Appeal in 2007 in relation to Princess Margaret's will, and again more recently regarding other senior royals. The reasoning courts have given is that publishing a monarch's or senior royal's will could compromise the dignity of the crown, or create security and privacy risks, given how much of their property and its location becomes public knowledge otherwise. Queen Elizabeth II's will, for instance, was ordered sealed for 90 years by the President of the High Court's Family Division following her death in 2022, a decision made openly, in a public judgment, even though the will's contents themselves remain confidential. That's a real documented legal mechanism, a genuinely unusual one, but it is about privacy of a legitimate will, not a hidden instrument engineered to redirect a grandchild's upbringing or override parental authority. There's no version of this process that lets one family member unilaterally reroute a minor's future title, guardianship, or training without the involvement of that child's own parents. Nothing in English law works that way, for a royal family or otherwise. Titles versus property. Two very different kinds of inheritance. A lot of confusion in invented royal content comes from blending two entirely separate concepts, the inheritance of a title and the inheritance of property. Titles like Prince of Wales, Duke of Cornwall, or the monarchy itself follow rules of succession that are a mix of common law, statute, and long constitutional convention. These are matters of public law, not private family decision-making. No grandmother, however senior her title, can rewrite who becomes heir or restructure a grandchild's position in the line of succession through a private legal instrument. Princess Charlotte's position in the line of succession currently fourth after her father, her older brother Prince George, and ahead of her younger brother Prince Louis, is fixed by statute and birth order, not by any discretionary trust a family member could alter. Property and money, by contrast, genuinely can be shaped by wills, trusts, and settlements, the way the duchies themselves originated centuries ago as exactly that kind of arrangement, land settled so that each generation lived off the income without being able to sell the underlying assets, ensuring continuity across generations. But that structure applies to the institutions, not to individual grandchildren, and it was set up by acts of parliament and royal charter centuries ago, not by any living family member acting alone in the present day. Another recurring feature of fabricated royal drama content is a struggle for influence involving the queen consort. It's worth being precise about what that title actually confers, because it's often the piece of the puzzle these stories get most wrong. Queen consort is a ceremonial and honorary title held by the wife of a reigning king. It denotes marriage to the monarch, not an independent constitutional office with formal authority over the upbringing, trusts, or succession arrangements of the monarch's grandchildren. A queen consort has no statutory role in decisions about a grandchild's inheritance, guardianship, or royal duties. Those matters sit with the child's parents and, where formal crown business is involved, with the mechanisms of state, not with an in-law's personal discretion. However long-standing her involvement in public royal life has been, why the fictional sealed trust trope doesn't hold up put those pieces together, and it becomes easy to see why viral stories about covenant trusts, charter seals, and grandmothers unilaterally reassigning a child's future don't reflect how any of this actually functions. The Duchy of Cornwall passes to the heir automatically. By centuries-old charter and statute, the moment his or her parent becomes monarch, there's no discretionary document that needs both conditions to be met, and no one needed to wait for a public recognition moment separate from the coronation itself. Royal wills are sealed for privacy reasons that courts explain in public judgments. They aren't secret instruments that let one relative override the parental authority of another. Succession and title are governed by public law and long-settled convention, not by a document one family member could draft to redirect a grandchild's future. The Queen Consort title carries prestige and public duties, but no formal authority over a grandchild who isn't hers. Actual royal financial change, like William's real 2026 decision to sell off part of the Duchy of Cornwall to fund housing and environmental projects, gets reported through official annual reports and mainstream financial journalism, not discovered via a dramatic confrontation in a corridor. Why the real story is still worth paying attention to none of this means royal finances are boring quite the opposite. The genuine story here is a 700-year-old system built to solve a real problem, still functioning today, still generating real controversy over tax exemptions, opaque investment holdings, and, as in 2024's, reporting on a Duchy of Lancaster lease to an NHS trust occasionally uncomfortable questions about how private royal estates profit from public institutions. The real 2026 headlines about the Duchy of Cornwall are genuinely dramatic in their own right. A nearly 700-year-old estate breaking with tradition to sell off a fifth of its landholdings, redirecting hundreds of millions of pounds toward homelessness projects and environmental restoration, explicitly invoking a shift away from being the traditional landowner. That's a real story about an institution built in the 1300s, adapting however incrementally to 21st century politics around housing and climate. It doesn't need an invented family feud to be interesting. It's a rare, verifiable case of one of Europe's oldest financial institutions changing in real time, in public, with real numbers attached to it.